Most people grow up with a simple picture of reality. The universe is space, matter, time, and energy, and human beings are small figures moving inside it, trying to survive, find meaning, and make sense of existence as best they can. History tells us this picture slowly improved over time, becoming clearer as knowledge advanced. But what if the opposite happened? What if an older, more complete map of reality once existed, and what we inherited is a simplified version, carefully trimmed down until only the surface remained? Ancient civilizations did not see reality as flat or accidental. They described it as a structured map with different levels, regions, and states of existence, each connected to the next. This map was not meant only to explain the stars or the gods, but to explain the human experience itself, why life feels fragmented, why meaning seems distant, why people sense that something essential is missing, even when all basic needs are met. According to these traditions, reality was once understood as a whole system, not just physical, but mental and spiritual as well. The visible world was only one layer in a much larger structure. Above it were subtler realms of awareness and order. Below it were denser states of form and repetition. Human beings were not random accidents in this map, but positioned inside it, carrying a connection to levels they could no longer clearly remember. Over Jimmy, map began to vanish from public teaching, not all at once, and not through a single decision. It was slowly rewritten. Complex ideas were replaced with simpler stories. Inner knowledge was turned into external belief. Instead of teaching people how reality was structured, institutions focused on telling them how to behave within it. Map did not disappear because it was false, but because it was dangerous to those who wanted control. Person who understands where they are in a system is harder to guide blindly. A person who knows reality has layers begins to question authority, fear, and imposed meaning. So the map was broken into fragments. Pieces survived in myths, forbidden texts, mystical language, and symbols that no longer made sense to the average person. What remained was a world that felt real, but incomplete. Even so, traces of the old map never fully vanished. They show up in quiet questions people ask themselves late at night, in they feeling that life is repeating patterns rather than moving toward resolution, in the sense that the world is real but not final. Feelings are not accidents. According to ancient thinkers, they are echoes of a map we once knew. You're interested in uncovering this erased structure step by step and following how ancient traditions tried to preserve it beneath layers of history. Subscribing to the channel helps you stay connected as we carefully rebuild this forgotten map without exaggeration or spectacle. Because before we can understand how this map was erased, we first need to understand what it actually showed. What did the ancients believe reality was made of? How was it organized? And why did that understanding change everything about who we are and where we exist within it? To understand the map that was erased, we need to let go of the modern habit of seeing reality as a single, open space where everything exists on the same level. Ancient traditions did not think this way. For them, reality was organized, layered, and ordered, more like a structured system than an empty container filled with objects. In this older view, existence was divided into distinct levels, each one defined not by location, but by clarity. The closer a level was to the source of reality, the more unified, aware, and complete it was. Us, reality, extended outward. It became more divided. Mori material limit. The physical world was not the starting point of existence, but one of its final expressions. This explains why ancient maps of reality always included more than what could be seen. The visible world was important, but it was never treated as the whole picture. Above it were realms of order, intelligence, and meaning that shaped what appeared below. Below it were states of density and repetition where awareness became increasingly bound to form and time. What mattered most in this map was not geography, but relationship. Each level existed in connection to the others, like layers of the same structure. Nothing was isolated. Everything flowed downward from a source, and, in principle, could return upward through recognition and alignment. Reality was not random. It was directional. This perspective made human life understandable in a way modern explanations often fail to do. If reality truly has layers, then feeling divided inside makes sense. Awareness comes from a higher level but lives in a lower one. Tension is inevitable. Longing, confusion, and the sense that something essential is missing are not psychological errors. They are symptoms of position within the map. Ancient thinkers believed that human beings occupied a unique place in this structure. The body clearly belonged to the physical Gawaichimi, decay, but consciousness did not behave the same way. It questioned its surroundings, imagined other possibilities. It sensed depth where none was officially acknowledged. This magi, humans, even if they no longer remembered it clearly. The erased map explained this role. It showed that people were not meant to be fully contained by the world they lived in. They were meant to understand it, navigate it, and eventually transcend its limits. This idea alone was enough to make the map dangerous, because it shifted authority away from external systems and back toward inner recognition. Once this structure is understood, the erasure itself becomes easier to recognize. Teaching people that reality has no deeper organization keeps them focused on surfaces. It removes the question of origin and replaces it with endless distraction. Without a map, people wander inside the structure without ever realizing they are inside one, and this leads directly to the next question. If the ancients understood reality as a layered system with a clear source, then what exactly was that source, and how did the rest of the structure come into being beneath it? At the very top of the erased map, ancient traditions placed a source that was not described as a god with human traits, but as a state of completeness. This source was not seen as a ruler issuing commands, but as the origin from which reality itself unfolded. It was described in simple terms because it was considered beyond form, beyond division, and beyond conflict. According to these teachings, this source was not something separate from existence. It was existence in its most unified state, where sun, being were not divided there. Nothing lacked purpose, because purpose was inherent. Nothing struggled to survive, because nothing was threatened. This level of reality was not experienced as a place you go to, but as a condition of fullness, where nothing needed to become anything else. From this source, reality did not explode outward violently, unfolded. Ancient thinkers described this process as a gentle expression, like light radiating from a flame or sound emerging from silence. Expression carried a quality of the source, but as it moved further outward, it became more defined and more limited. Unity slowly gave way to distinction. This unfolding created the higher layers of the map. These layers were still close to the source, still ordered, still aware, but no longer completely unified. They functioned as organizing principles rather than physical places. They shaped meaning, pattern, and intelligence before anything became solid or measurable. The important detail is this: the source did not lose anything by expressing reality. It remained complete. What changed was distance. The further reality extended from the source, the more awareness became fragmented. This was not seen as a mistake at first. It was simply the nature of expression moving away from unity. The erased map taught that problems only began when parts of this structure forgot the source altogether. When awareness became focused on its own creations rather than its origin, imbalance appeared. Lower levels began to operate with partial understanding. Order remained, but meaning thinned out. Structure persisted, but fullness did not. This is where the map becomes deeply unsettling. It suggests that the lower worlds, including the highest source, but by forces that are already removed from it. These forces could build, organize, and maintain systems, but they could not restore unity because they no longer remembered it fully. For human beings, this explains a deep contradiction. Life is intelligent, yet often feels hollow. Nature is ordered, yet indifferent. Systems function, but do not care whether we feel whole inside them. According to the erased map, this is exactly what a reality looks like when it is far from its source. Understanding this source changes the entire story. It reframes existence, not as a punishment or test, but as a descent into distance. And it reframes awakening not as becoming something new, but as remembering something old. Once this source is understood, the next part of the map becomes unavoidable. If reality descended layer by layer away from unity, then who or what shaped the lower regions? And how did they become the world we now mistake for the whole of existence? Once the erased map moves below the source, its tone changes. The higher layers are described with harmony and clarity, but the lower regions are described with precision, structure, and limitation. According to ancient teachings, these lower levels were shaped by builders who no longer had a full view of the original design. They could organize reality, but they could not restore its unity. These builders were not portrayed as monsters or devils, but as forces of administration. They governed rules, patterns, cycles, and boundaries. Their world was one of order without depth. Everything functioned, but nothing remembered why it existed beyond function itself. This is why the lower reality feels mechanic even when it is beautiful. The erased map explained that these builders worked by imitation. They copied the structure of higher realms without understanding their essence. They could replicate form, symmetry, and law, but not fullness. The result was a reality that looks complete from the inside, but feels hollow once you begin to question it. World that operates efficiently, yet never resolves the deeper sense of lack. This is where time becomes central. In the lower structure, everything is governed by sequence. Past leads to present. Present leads to future. Growth always requires waiting. Completion is always postponed. The system stays stable by keeping awareness moving forward, never arriving. From the ancient perspective, time itself was one of the strongest tools of containment. The builders of the lower world believed their creation was the highest reality, operating without memory of the source. They assumed nothing existed beyond their system. This ignorance was not malicious, but it was absolute. Anything that suggested a higher order felt threatening because it exposed the limits of their authority. This explains why ancient texts often describe the lower world as confident but blind. Laws exist, structures hold, systems repeat reliably, but meaning is outsourced to belief, obedience, or hope. The world tells you how to live, but not why you exist. It keeps you moving, but never fulfilled. Human beings, according to the erased map, were placed directly inside this lower structure. The body was perfectly adapted to it. It aged with time. It obeyed gravity. It followed biological cycles. But consciousness behaved differently. It questioned the rules. It imagined other states. It felt displaced. This difference was not accidental. It was the crack in the system. What made this knowledge dangerous is that it reframed authority completely. If the lower world was built by limited forces, then its rules were not absolute. If its builders were not connected to the source, then obedience was not sacred. And if consciousness came from higher levels, then fear lost its ultimate power. This part of the map was one of the first to be erased because it undermined control at its route. A person who believes the world is a broken copy stops treating it as final, beginning to observe instead of submit. They stop confusing survival with truth, and this leads to the most unsettling part of the erased map. If the lower world is a constructed system, then what role does it play in the movement of consciousness itself? And why does awareness seem to return here again and again? Once the lower world is understood as a constructed system rather than the highest level of reality, a question naturally takes shape, one that ancient thinkers considered unavoidable. Consciousness does not originate here, and if this world is a limited copy of something greater, then why does awareness keep returning to it life after life, generation after generation? According to the erased map, the answer has less to do with punishment or moral failure and more to do with orientation. Consciousness, once immersed in the lower structure, slowly begins to identify with it. The longer awareness operates inside a system governed by time, form, and repetition, the more natural that system feels. Eventually, return familiarity, while what lies beyond feels distant and abstract. The ancients believed that the lower world was not only a place to live, but a mechanism that trained consciousness. From birth, awareness is taught to see through the body, to measure itself through comparison, and to define meaning through external achievement. Memory resets with each life, but the habit of identification remains. Consciousness learns to look outward for fulfillment, and outward is exactly where the system keeps it. This is where cycles become important. Birth, growth, struggle, aging, and death repeat so consistently that they begin to feel inevitable. The map showed that repetition itself was not accidental. It was stabilizing. A system built on cycles does not need to trap awareness violently. Only needs to offer continuation, another chance, another story, another unfinished lesson. From this perspective, return is rarely forced. It is chosen, but chosen from within limitation. Consciousness returns because it still believes something essential is missing and can be completed inside the system. Desire, guilt, attachment, and unresolved identity all act like weights, pulling awareness back toward familiar ground. This is why ancient traditions placed so much emphasis on forgetting. Each return wipes memory of the larger map. Consciousness begins again with a clean surface, unaware that it has walked the same terrain many chimis before. Life feels new, urgent, and absolute, even though the structure remains unchanged. What makes this difficult to notice is that the system rewards engagement. It offers pleasure, relationship, creativity, and meaning, but always within boundaries. These rewards are not illusions in the sense of being unreal. They are incomplete. They keep consciousness invested without ever allowing it to resolve the deeper sense of lack. Human beings feel this tension most clearly. Part of us adapts to the cycle, builds a life, and finds moments of joy. Another part senses repetition beneath the novelty, feeling that history echoes itself, that personal struggles rhyme, that the world keeps asking the same questions without offering final answers. According to the erased map, this intuition is not imagination, it is memory without context. The map taught that return continues until recognition interrupts it. As long as consciousness believes the lower world is the source of meaning, it will keep coming back, not because it is trapped by force, but because it is oriented toward the wrong level of reality. Understanding this shifts responsibility inward. The cycle is not maintained by an external jailer alone, but by identification itself, and this leads to a crucial turning point. If return is driven by identification, then loosening identification during life changes everything about what happens next. The erased map did not promise escape through belief or obedience. It pointed instead to recognition, ability to see the system clearly without hatred or fear, and to remember that awareness does not belong to what it observes. And that brings us to the next layer of the map. If consciousness can recognize the structure while still alive, then what changes internally when that recognition begins to stabilize? And how does the system respond when awareness starts to slip beyond its usual patterns? According to the erased map, the moment consciousness begins to recognize the structure it lives inside, something subtle but decisive shifts. Life does not immediately change. On the surface, the world continues to function the same way. Time still moves forward. Responsibilities remain, but internally, awareness starts relating to experience differently, and this difference weakens the grip of the system. Recognition does not arrive as a dramatic realization. It often begins as a quiet distancing. Thoughts are still there, but they no longer feel identical to the one observing them. Emotions still rise, but they are seen more clearly as movements rather than commands. Identity becomes something noticed instead of something automatically inhabited. This inner shift may feel small, but within the logic of the erased map, it is enormous. The ancients believed the system depended on immediacy. React now, identify now, believe now. When awareness pauses, even briefly, the mechanism loses efficiency. The soul becomes less predictable. It no longer moves entirely by impulse, fear, or desire. This is why recognition was considered dangerous to the structure, not because it attacked it, but because it no longer fed it fully. At this stage, many people experience a strange mixture of clarity and Discomfort. Clarity, because patterns become visible. Discomfort, because what once felt meaningful may begin to feel hollow. Old goals lose their urgency. External validation feels less satisfying. This can create a sense of disorientation, as if the old map has collapsed, but the new one is not yet fully drawn. The erased map warned that this phase is often misunderstood. People may assume something is wrong, that motivation is fading or meaning is disappearing. In reality, meaning is being relocated. It is no longer projected outward into this system. It is slowly being withdrawn back toward awareness itself. This is also when the system tends to respond, not through punishment, but through distraction. New identities appear. New explanations offer comfort. One may become attached to being the one who sees, turning recognition into another role. The ancients were clear about this danger. Any identity, even a spiritual one, can be absorbed back into the structure if awareness clings to it. True recognition, according to the map, is quiet. Well, does not need to announce itself. It does not confirmation. It expresses itself through simplicity, through the ability to experience life without constantly narrating it, through moments of presence where nothing needs to be added or explained. As recognition stabilizes, something important happens. Fear loses some of its urgency, not because threats disappear, but because awareness is no longer fully fused with what is. Threatened desire becomes less compulsive. Suffering still exists, but it no longer defines the whole field of experience. The soul begins to feel lighter, not happier in a superficial sense, but less compressed. The erased map taught that this inner lightness directly affects what happens beyond life as well. A soul that is practiced observing without clinging is less likely to be pulled by familiarity alone. Recognition during life becomes preparation, not through effort, but through habit. And this leads to another crucial layer of the map. If recognition weakens the system's grip, then the system will not remain passive. It will adapt. It will refine its distractions. It will attempt to pull awareness back into roles that feel meaningful and safe. Understanding this response is essential because it reveals why awakening is not a straight line and why the final layers of the erased map were guarded so carefully. According to the erased map, recognition never happens in a vacuum. The moment awareness begins to loosen its identification with the structure responds, not aggressively, and not in a way that is easy to point at, but through subtle pressure designed to restore familiarity. The ancients understood this reaction well, and they warned that this phase is where many people become confused about what is happening to them. One of the first signs of resistance is distraction that feels meaningful. New paths appear. New explanations arise. The world suddenly offers fresh reasons to stay engaged. Improved versions of the same patterns. More refined goals. More convincing narratives. Awareness is not pulled back through fear, but through relevance. The system becomes interesting. Again, another common response is doubt. Clarity that once felt obvious may begin to feel uncertain. Old questions return with more force. Was this just imagination? Am I overthinking things? Maybe the world really is all there is. These doubts are not failures of recognition. They are part of the stabilizing mechanism. The structure prefers certainty of any kind over open awareness. even skeptical certainty. The ancients also noticed that emotional intensity often increases at this stage. Relationships, ambitions, conflicts, and responsibilities seem to demand more attention than before. This is not because life suddenly changed, but because awareness is being pulled back toward identification. Strong emotion narrows perception. It collapses observation into reaction, and reaction restores the familiar loop. What made this phase especially challenging is that nothing about it feels unnatural. There is no clear enemy to fight. Life simply asks to be taken seriously again, urgently, fully, without distance. Many people interpret this as a sign they should abandon recognition and return to normal patterns. Others push harder, turning awareness into effort, which only creates new tension. The erased map offered a different approach. It suggested that resistance is not something to overcome, but something to notice. The moment awareness can observe distraction without being consumed by it, the mechanism weakens again. The system loses leverage when reaction is replaced by clarity. This is why patience mattered so much in ancient teachings. Recognition was not meant to eliminate the world, but to change the relationship with it. The world continues to present challenges, stories, and demands, but awareness no longer collapses entirely into them. It learns to remain present without surrendering identity. If you've noticed moments in your own life where clarity appeared, faded, and then returned again, or where the world seemed to pull you back just as something began to shift inside, sharing that experience in the comments Chaloni. This process, because these patterns are far more common than most people realize. Us recognition survives resistance. It begins to mature, becomes quieter, less dramatic and more stable. And with that stability comes the final and most important insight of the erased map. If this system can distract, pressure, and adapt, then freedom cannot depend on circumstances at all. It must rest in something the structure cannot reach, imitate, or pull back into itself. As the erased map approaches its deepest layer, it stops describing systems, rulers, or cycles, and begins pointing towards something much simpler and much harder to explain. The ancients believed that if freedom were dependent on circumstances, environments, or outcomes, it could always be taken away. So they searched for what remained, untouched no matter how the structure shifted. Their conclusion was quiet and precise. What the system cannot reach is awareness before it turns into idea, not awareness of thoughts, emotions, or roles, but the simple fact of being conscious itself prior to any definition. This was not considered a belief or a state to achieve, but a constant presence that most people overlook because it feels too ordinary. Everything the structure works with is something that can be named: body, personality, memory, fear, desire, even spiritual identity. These can all be influenced, redirected, rewarded, or threatened. But awareness itself, the space in which all of these appear, does not participate in the system. It observes it. The erased map taught that the trap only functions where identification exists. The moment awareness fully believes it is a thought, an emotion, or a role, it becomes movable. It can be guided by fear or comfort. But when awareness recognizes itself as the one seeing these movements, something fundamental shifts. There is distance without separation, involvement without entanglement. This is why ancient teachings avoided giving final descriptions of truth. Any description turns awareness into an object, and objects belong to the structure. Instead, they used pointing, language, metaphors, and paradoxes not to confuse, but to prevent fixation. The goal was never to replace one identity with another, but to dissolve the habit of identity altogether. From this perspective, liberation is not dramatic. It does not feel like escape. Feels like simplicity. The sense of constantly needing to become something fades. Life continues, but it no longer defines what awareness is. Experiences arise and pass, but they no longer leave the same residue. The soul feels lighter, not because it gained something, but because it stopped carrying what never truly belonged to it. The erased map suggested that once this recognition stabilizes, the system loses its most effective tools. Fear loses urgency because awareness is no longer fully identified with what can be lost. Desire loses compulsion because fulfillment is no longer projected into the future. Even distraction loses some of its power because awareness recognizes when attention is being pulled. This does not make someone passive or detached from life. Makis participation clearer. Action happens without the constant pressure of self-definition. Responsibility exists without existential weight. The world is engaged, but not mistaken for the source of identity. And this clarity has implications beyond life itself. According to the erased map, what happens at the moment of transition depends entirely on identification. If awareness is still fused with roles and stories, it is drawn back toward familiarity. But if awareness rests in itself without needing explanation or comfort, there is nothing for the structure to grasp. This brings the map to its final boundary. If freedom rests in recognition rather than escape, then the most important question is no longer about what happens after death, but about how this recognition is lived now, quietly, inside an ordinary life. When the erased map reaches this point, it stops functioning like a description of the universe and starts functioning like a mirror. The ancients believed that once awareness recognizes what the structure cannot reach, the question is no longer how to escape reality, but how to live within it without forgetting what you are. This is where many misunderstand the map. Remembering it does not mean rejecting the world, abandoning responsibilities, or treating life as meaningless. The ancients did not teach withdrawal. They taught orientation. To know where you are in the structure changes how you relate to everything inside it. Work still happens. Relationships still matter. Pain and joy still arise. But they're no longer mistaken for identity. I becomes something experienced rather than something that defines the soul. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Fear loses its absolute authority. Failure loses its finality. Success loses its power to inflate the self. The erased map reframed meaning itself. Meaning was not something the world gives you when you behave correctly or achieve enough. Meaning was something remembered when awareness stops outsourcing its value to systems built on repetition. When identity loosens, meaning stops being conditional. The ancients believed this was the true function of human life within the lower world. Not to perfect the system and not to destroy it, but to see through it while still participating, to move through time without being owned by it. Tuzi, form without mistaking it for the source. That is why they warned against turning recognition into a belief system. The moment the map becomes something you have, identity forms around it. And identity, even a spiritual one, belongs to the structure. The map was meant to be used and then set aside like a tool that helps you orient yourself until orientation becomes natural. Living with the map, remembered often feels quieter than beyond expect. There is less urgency to prove, fix, or complete oneself. The need to be certain softens. Curiosity replaces anxiety. Awareness learns to rest without constantly narrating. Experience. This does not make life smaller. It makes it lighter. From this place, the cycle loses its emotional gravity. The promise of later no longer dominates attention. Hope becomes less compulsive because completeness is no longer projected into the future. Even the idea of return begins to lose its pull because awareness no longer believes it is unfinished. The erased map taught that this inner shift prepares the soul more effectively than any ritual or belief, not by effort, but by familiarity. Awareness becomes familiar with itself without form. When form dissolves, nothing feels missing. This brings everything full circle. The map was erased not because it was inaccurate, but because it revealed too much. It showed that the structure is not absolute, that authority is not final, and that freedom does not depend on permission. And that leads to the final question the ancients left behind. If this map still exists beneath history, beneath belief, and beneath identity, then what? Does it change when it is remembered fully? And why was its final piece considered the most dangerous of all? At the very end of the erased map, the ancients placed a realization so destabilizing that it explains why the map itself could never remain intact. The most dangerous idea was not that reality had layers, or that the world was a constructed system, but that freedom did not require permission, intermediaries, or time. Required recognition, and recognition could happen. Now, the final piece of the map showed that no authority, divine or human, stood between awareness and its source. No ritual could grant it. No institution could withhold it. Gnosticism could ultimately block it. The moment awareness recognizes itself as prior to identity, prior to story, and prior to the structure itself, the system loses its claim, not symbolically, but functionally. This is why the map was erased, rather than debated. A belief can be argued against, a doctrine can be replaced, but recognition spreads quietly and undermines control. Without confrontation, a person who no longer mistakes the structure for the source cannot be governed in the same way. Fear weakens. Obedience becomes conditional. Meaning is no longer outsourced. The ancients understood that once this realization stabilized in enough people, systems built on repetition and authority would hollow out from within, not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. The structure would still exist, but it would no longer define what a human being is. This reframes history itself. The erasure of the map was not about hiding information, but about preventing remembrance, because remembrance cannot be centralized, regulated, or taxed. Does not require belief. It only requires attention. Living with this final piece, remembered, does not make someone special, superior, or detached from life. It makes them quieter inside, less reactive, less driven by fear of loss or hope of completion. Life is still lived, but it is no longer confused with identity, and this is why the map matters now, not as an ancient curiosity, as a living orientation in a world overflowing with noise, urgency, and borrowed meaning, remembering what you are before the structure tells you who to be is an act of clarity. If rebuilding this erased map step by step has helped you see reality from a new angle, subscribing to the channel keeps you connected as we continue exploring these forgotten structures with depth, care, and honesty, without exaggeration or spectacle, because the map was never truly destroyed. It was forgotten, and the moment it is remembered, even partially, it stops being history and starts becoming experience.